Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here. My name's Brian. And today I'm talking about a couple movies that I think could only have been made when they were made. One is from 1989, the other's from 91. I kind of feel like they both feel kind of like 80s movies, although the more I think about the second one, the more I think about some of the crazy stuff we started to see in the 90s in terms of action. But anyway, let's get into this. These are a couple Kino Blu-rays. Let's start with The Experts. Again, 1989. As you can see, John Travolta, co-starring with Ari Gross and Kelly Preston and others. And it is a fascinating Cold War comedy that sort of gets more intense towards the end. But I think the idea is that Travolta and Ari Gross play Travis and Wendell. They're sort of these down-on-your-luck New Yorkers, and they get kind of kidnapped, but sort of willingly so, under the guise of the idea that they'll come to this new town and open a nightclub. And, of course, this new town is set up at the beginning of the movie, and it's actually in the Soviet Union, and it is a replica of a American town where they're having KGB agents trained to be American, speak English, and live like Americans, but it's kind of out of date, so it feels like it's from the 1950s, and Charles Martin Smith, who plays one of the sort of head honchos of this town and this wing of, or this arm of the KGB, feels like they need some real Americans to update things because their agents will be not able to function properly in the 1980s in the United States unless they have this training. So they kidnap these guys, they make them think they're redoing this club, they bring them to this place in KGB in Soviet Union, and it's just kind of crazy because it's like these Americans talking in the hip dialogue of 1989, and having crazy technology like Walkmans, and so it's a funny idea. I think Kelly Preston plays one of the Soviet agents in the town, as does Deborah Foreman. So Kelly Preston becomes the sort of love interest for John Travolta, and Deborah Foreman becomes a love interest for Ari Gross. I love both those actors, and it should be noted that this is the movie, I guess, where Travolta and Kelly Preston started to actually become romantically interested in each other, and of course would later be married until her passing recently. But yeah, you can feel that they have a great chemistry together, and I also just love having Deborah Foreman in this. She's one of my favorites. Got to meet her recently at a screening of Valley Girl, and it was delightful. She was wonderful. But the cast also includes James Keach, Brian Doyle Murray. I mentioned Charles Martin Smith. Rick Dukeman from The Burbs plays like an interesting role as like the town preacher, but he's very like they're hiring to get people into the nightclub, and he's like, I want to work here, and they're like, no, dude, no, you can't. And he is kind of always keeping an eye on them, always kind of suspicious of them. But like I said, it sort of ramps up into more of an intense action thing at the end. I think it's fascinating. It's directed by Dave Thomas, who, of course, is from, Second City. I'm sorry, he's from, I always think of Bob and Deb McKenzie, Strange Brew. And he's the director. And there's a little interview with him on here, which is cool because he talks about, I'll get to that in a second, but so this is a new HD master from a 4K scan of the original camera negative by Paramount. And this film has definitely not looked this good in a long time. In fact, I'm sure it had a DVD release, but it completely passed me by. So it's basically a movie I haven't seen since VHS. And back in the day when I ran I didn't run my video store. When I worked in a video store on a campus location, I made an 80s section, and this is exactly the kind of movie that I would put in that section because it really does feel very of its time, very 1980s. There's a sequence where they're opening the club and they have a bunch of people come in and they don't know how to dance because they're square Russian KGB agents. So Travolta teaches them how to dance, and in the making of, Dave Thomas talks about allowing Travolta to really spearhead the choreography on that. They hired a choreographer, but he did a lot of the choreography of that dance scene, which, of course, he was known for Saturday Night Fever at the time and just a good dancer. And so that's a fun scene. But yeah, I think it's interesting that we have, hit shows now like The Americans, with this being kind of a goofy comedic swing towards something like that. I'm not saying that this is an influence on that show in any way, but it's something where you look at this goofy movie and you see how great a dramatic premise it can sort of set up, in the reverse, if that makes sense. So I think that's funny. But anyway, so the making of The Experts with director Dave Thomas, about 13 minutes, and he talks about being brought on board the project when it was already going and Travolta was attached. So it was kind of like a for-hire job, and he just, came in and tried to make it funny, and he's a good director in that way. So he talked about the dance stuff and casting Kelly Preston and Ari Gross, in terms of getting a nice sidekick for Travolta. And I think the two of them really do work well together. And it's fascinating to see these New York dudes in this small, quote unquote, American town and just being like, where can we get a burger, and just ridiculous stuff like that. And this club is like this old tiki bar that they have to update to, I forget what they call it, like Soho, I guess is what it's called. Anyway, he goes through the themes. He talks about working with the different actors, and it's a Zoom interview, but it's good to see Dave Thomas and hear his thoughts on this film, which I think has been, like I said, somewhat forgotten since 1989. So definitely a fun addition to your 80s comedy collection. And then next up we have Stone Cold from 1991, starring Brian Bosworth, who was a big football player around this time. And like I said, this is a 90s movie, but it feels like an 80s movie in some ways because it feels like it's taking off on something like Cobra, or movies of that ilk. But then I was thinking to myself, because the action gets insane, and I think that's one of the reasons the movie is such a beloved film, is it's got a tongue-in-cheek sort of comedic nature to it in terms of the Bosworth character who, ends up going undercover for the FBI to infiltrate this biker gang. In fact, let me read this is a brand new HD master from a 2K scan of the 35 inner positive. It looks better than the previous Arrow Blu-ray, which had come out, which had no features at all, and this has some nice features, and I'll get into that. But when it comes to nonstop action, Stone Cold is red hot. NFL superstar Brian the Boz Bosworth makes his movie debut as John Stone, the only cop tough enough to take out a gang of stone cold killers. Going undercover, he has to pose as an outlaw biker to win the trust of their diabolic leader, Chains, that's Lance Henriksen, and his right-hand psychopath, Ice, that is William Forsythe, who's great in this. Played by screen legends Lance Henriksen and William Forsythe, of course. Stone soon discovers there's more to these bikers than heavy metal mayhem. They're plotting a paramilitary assault on the state capitol, where one of their men has been sentenced to execution. In a spectacular climax, Stone is up against the gang and on his own, and the killers soon discover that if you go up against John Stone, he'll burn you cold, stone cold. From director Craig R. Baxley, Action Jackson, I Come in Peace. It's a full tilt, in-your-face thriller packed with explosive effects and breathtaking high-wire tension. And that is true. There's some great stories that sort of come out in the features about how this was originally going to be directed by Bruce Malmuth, who did Nighthawks, among other things, and that it was going to be much more of a dramatic, character-based road biker movie and less of an action movie. And it's not fully clear what happened, but I guess the producers behind the scenes realized that movie was not going to be as commercially successful and that they needed to really amp this up, and they do. Like I said, there's intense action, bloody violence, and the siege on the Capitol at the end is really not like too many films you've ever seen. It has a motorcycle chase scene, which you don't see a lot of those. But yeah, when they storm the Capitol, they're riding their bikes through the Capitol building in, I think, Arkansas. I forget where they shot that. But it was to the point where they actually got into sort of a tiff with the governmental folks about, like, you can't bring bikes in here, but they had gotten permission and they had gotten permits and they had insurance. And so they were able to film this crazy action scene. Helicopters getting crashed into by bikes and just insane stuff. And they use some crazy machine guns, kind of like the one they use in I Come in Peace, now that I think about it, where they're just tearing people up with these guns. And they're just, like I said, it's comedic at the beginning. It starts out like Cobra in that he's in the supermarket shopping and somebody tries to rob the place and he kind of makes a goofy, foil of it. So it's a little less serious. And then you go back to his apartment and you see he's got a pet Komodo dragon and just weird stuff like that. But once he gets into the gang and you meet Lance Henriksen and William Forsythe's characters, like, this is serious and he could be killed at any time. And there is just a great tension that starts there because you just like, when are they going to turn on him? When is he going to slip up and they won't, trust him, and then he's dead. And the other thing that's neat about it, and you can feel it in terms of that tension, is that, and Lance Henriksen talks about it in his interview, but they cast real bikers as extras and I guess sort of, other gang members in this biker gang. And so you can feel a certain authenticity and a certain uneasiness about these dudes. They just look like real grizzled biker dudes, like real, not like, cast, pretty boy type bikers. These are real dudes and you can feel it. And I've always thought Lance Henriksen was an interesting choice as the leader because he's kind of skinny. He I guess he was hitting the gym a lot, and this is as muscular as he'll look, but he wears like these tank tops and things and a skull cap, and he just doesn't fully, he radiates power because he is that kind of an actor, but physically I was always like, this doesn't quite feel right to me, but somehow he pulls it off. And William Forsythe backing him up works perfectly. Like, he feels like he was very method, and apparently Bosworth said he was about his biker thing and didn't wash his hair and all this stuff. Anyway, so it's super fun, crazy action movie. Like I said, has a cult following, is getting this new scan, and has a bunch of nice features, which I'll go through, like 4 interviews with cast members here. So you talk to the first one being The Boz Goes Hollywood, an interview with Brian Bosworth, which is almost 20 minutes, and he talks about his football career ending and not being ready to transition to anything when he got the call from Michael Douglas, apparently, to do this movie. I guess Michael Douglas is a producer. And he said he wasn't really ready to do it, but he was talked into it. And he talks about having given up motorcycle riding before going into football and when his career was over, which was sort of the depression he was struggling through when he got cast in this film. How he sort of fell back in love with riding motorcycles, which he had done when he was younger, but had promised himself he wouldn't do after he was injured early on before he was even in college, I think. Anyway, so he has a lot of great stories about, working on this movie, working with the different actors, the original direction of the film, like I said, with Bruce Malmuth versus what happened when Craig R. Baxley took over. Baxley had directed a bunch of A-Team episodes and was great with action. He's one of the sort of stunt performer directors, so he did Action Jackson and I Come in Peace, as I said before, and really great with the action set pieces. And another thing about it is this movie would be so different now in that it would be so much more CG, and it's all practical explosions and squibs, and it's not anything but the real deal here, and that's part of the reason I think it feels authentic and even crazier. But anyway, so new direction with Craig Baxley, and it sounds like Bosworth was a little disappointed because he had sort of a character arc that was a little bit more dramatic and interesting than what they ended up with, because they basically sounds like they sort of reshot the beginning stuff to make it with a little more levity. But talking about how William Forsythe and Lance Henriksen helped him, and some of the great stories in the production and the stunts. And this was produced by Heather Buckley and edited by Elijah Drenner. Very cool. The Brotherhood, an interview with Lance Henriksen, is about 11 minutes, and he talks about, again, the action scenes, being okay, but the script really needing to be improvised and how they had to sort of work on it themselves. And there's a lot of great dialogue that they must have come up with on the days or before the days they shot, because there's some really memorable macho lines in this. But he also talks about the difficulties of getting that, but he was the one who says, we need real bikers or this isn't going to be believable and this movie's not going to work. So we can either do that or we're in big trouble. And so he basically was able to talk the producers into casting these real bikers, and there was a lot of challenges with that, using these non-actor bikers in the movie and how tricky that could be, but how he felt like it ultimately benefited the movie. And he's just a really fun interview. I really dig hearing him talk about this. Then there's Breaking Free, an interview with actress Elabera Holzbog, who plays sort of the love interest Nancy for Bosworth in this film. And she talks about being cast and the Bruce Malmuth versus Craig R. Baxley thing. Some really harrowing moments she had on the set with some of the bikers, and working with Bosworth and Henriksen. And it's a very nice interview about her process and her memories of the film. And then lastly, Playing Straight, interview with Sam McMurray, who I barely mentioned, and if at all. He plays like sort of the square FBI guy who's helping the Bosworth character, because he's a cop and he needs an FBI guide, and he's kind of that, but he's, like I said, he's kind of a square, and so he has to sort of get into the gang, but he's also mostly comedic relief, and he's just wonderful. I've always loved Sam McMurray as an actor from Raising Arizona on up. Like, he's just one of my favorites. Really good in Freaks and Geeks too, by the way, but love him. And he's got a great sense of humor, and he just talks about reworking dialogue scenes for Brian Bosworth when Bosworth didn't want to say as much dialogue as was in a given scene. I guess McMurray would like rework the scene so that I guess he had more of the dialogue and Bosworth had less, and so he did that stuff. And apparently he came up with a really interesting ending bit in the climactic moments of the film, which it's a spoiler if you haven't seen the movie, so maybe wait to watch this until then. But it's pretty interesting that they were in the position to take ideas and use ideas from actors on the set on the day. They just were coming up with interesting stuff. So very enjoyable interview, and I'm a big fan of him. There's also a little bit about Mickey Rourke loaning his motorcycle to Lance Henriksen for the movie and then sending him a bill for it later, which I guess was a shock to Henriksen. But anyway, super fun action movie, and very excited for folks to get this. Has a nice reversible cover art action happening, and looks better than it has those nice features. I really enjoyed all the interviews, the Bosworth one especially. He's very earnest in his response in talking about this film, which was obviously a big deal to him at the time. So fun stuff from Kino, both recommended. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.